This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi everyone, I'm Tanya.
And I'm Talia.
And we are Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hi, Talia.
Hi, Tanya.
How are you?
I'm doing splendid. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good. That's great. Good to hear. I hope everybody else is doing amazing.
Yes, I'd like to welcome everyone back to another exciting episode of Crimes and Consequences. Thanks
Super
for
exciting.
Joining us.
It's a thriller.
I have an unusual case today.
I love that.
But before I tell you, just going to ask everyone to hit the subscribe or follow button on whatever app you're listening to. And I'm going to give you a little history lesson. That's how we're going to start.
Oh, okay. I like true crime, Tanya.
Well,
is there murder in the history lesson?
Yes.
Oh, okay. That's
eventually.
Fine. That's good.
As you know, during World War II, Adolf Hitler and the German army took over several European countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, just to name a few. Specifically, in France, they signed an armistice in late June 1940, and the Nazis physically occupied France until the end of the war in 1945. Almost immediately after the Nazi occupation began, the French resistance started. And the resistance was a group of people, men and women, who would do various things such as publish underground newspapers, they spied for the Allies, they helped captured soldiers escape, and important to our story today, they would help Jews escape France.
So they're trying to get the Nazis to get the fuck out of France.
Yes. And they're doing everything they can to overturn the war effort.
That's how I summarize that history lesson.
Living in France at the time was a medical doctor, Dr. Marcel Petiot. I'm going to call him Marcel. He was a loyal Frenchman who had fought during World War I. He had been drafted into that war in 1916. And he was the type of soldier that was willing to just put his ass on the line to fight for France. During one battle, Marcel was wounded after being hit by shrapnel from a German stick grenade.
What?
A stick grenade.
Okay.
I know.
What's a stick grenade?
It's a grenade shaped like a stick. I don't know.
I don't know. It sounds painful.
But this didn't stop him in the battle. He forged on in the fight and almost didn't seem to notice his wounds or all of the bombing that's going on around him.
It's got that adrenaline pumping.
Yeah, exactly. His fellow soldiers saw his brave stance, and it gave them courage to fight even harder. And eventually, the advancement of the German army seemed to slow. That is until they released mustard gas.
Oh.
And that was used in World War I. So a gas mask was part of every soldier's equipment at that point in the war. And as the green-yellow clouds of chlorine gas was deployed, the men in Marcel's unit all began to put on their gas masks to protect themselves. However, delirious with blood loss and probably jacked up on adrenaline like you mentioned, Marcel didn't notice. And he breathed a deep breath of this lung-destroying gas and then passed out. He awoke to find himself in the hospital. As Marcel recuperated, the doctors noticed signs of shell shock, what we call PTSD today. He was anxious to get back on the battlefield, even before he was fully recovered. Like, he tried to go back out there and fight.
He just kicked some fucking Nazi ass.
Yes, exactly. When Marcel was fully physically healed, he was not released from the hospital, and the doctors were concerned about his mental state. He grew bored while in the hospital and began committing small crimes, such as stealing blankets or other items from fellow soldiers, like photos of their girlfriends or letters back home. It's very weird. Nothing really of actual value, except he also stole morphine, and he developed a pretty heavy addiction to the drug.
Not uncommon these days.
Right. Because Marcel stole government property, the blankets, and the morphine, he was moved from the hospital to a local jail. I'm not sure what his sentence was, but when it was time for Marcel to be released after serving his sentence, he was put in front of a tribunal of judges who would decide whether he was competent enough to return to the front lines. Despite showing some early signs of mental illness, Marcel was deployed back to the trenches.
Now, do they think that mental illness was a result of what he's seen, was a result of the chemicals, or some sort of organic mental illness?
I think they believed probably it was organic and maybe contributed, or maybe the war
Triggered it?
Yes. And you would think that Marcel would be excited to go back to the front lines since he was all about that when he first got wounded, but he really didn't. The time he had spent in the hospital and jail changed him. He felt that France had betrayed him, and therefore, when he went back, he refused to follow orders given to him by his superiors.
So now he's not liking his own people, the French?
Right.
What if I have a feeling you're going to tell me some nasty-ass shit soon?
Oh, I'm going to.
I just can see it in her eyes right now. She's got this twinkle. He does some nasty shit, doesn't he?
He does some nasty shit.
Okay.
But I got to give you the background.
Okay, I'm with you.
The gusto for the fight that he had left him, and he was more concerned with self-preservation. So much so that he eventually shot himself in the foot so that he could go back to the army hospital and recuperate. The wound was officially classified as a misfire, but his superiors, the doctors, everybody knew what he had done. As a matter of fact...
I mean, it's pretty cliche, actually, right?
I know, right? Yeah, as a matter of fact, like, communist seditionists would spread pamphlets to soldiers telling them exactly how to inflict this wound. You know, to try to get the, war to come to an end. Once he was healed, he was returned to the trenches again. And this time, he was even more combative with his superior officers. He basically, told them all to just fuck off.
I mean, yeah, he shot himself in the foot to not be there. He's probably fucking pissed.
He was. He also exhibited a new set of shell shock symptoms. Amnesia, suicidal tendencies, sleepwalking, depression, and his superior officers began to believe he was a danger to his own unit. He was returned to the hospital and eventually, finally, discharged from the army, determined to be 40% disabled, and he was granted a pension. He was sent out into the world a free man. When World War I ended, Marcel realized he wouldn't be able to live on this 40% disability pension he got from the government. He found a lawyer who helped him to petition to receive 100% disability due to his mental illness, and he was awarded the full pension. He was examined by doctors, one of whom recommended that Marcel be admitted to an insane asylum until he was diagnosed to not need the pension any further. But the attorney who helped him get the pension didn't mention that to the judge because he knew the asylums were rough and lacking in many things at that point.
Hell yeah.
He didn't want to subject, Marcel to that. Even though Marcel received a full pension, enough to live on for the rest of his life, he didn't sit on his laurels. Boredom was always an enemy of his, and he decided to attend medical school.
Oh, shit. You got someone that's getting a disability for mental health reasons and he's going to medical school.
Oh, yeah. He threw himself into his studies so completely. He finished medical school in 8 months.
What?
Right.
Wow.
And from that began a 2-year psychiatric internship, which I thought was kind of ironic.
Very much so.
And he did complete that with distinction, meaning very high marks through the whole thing. I should warn you that you might be thinking Marcel's this amazing man.
It really didn't cross my mind yet, but...
Going to medical school for some altruistic motive, but that wasn't the case. There was a small part of him that wanted to be a doctor so he could have access to an unlimited supply of morphine for his own personal use.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. He graduated in December of 1921 and was given a license to practice medicine anywhere in France. Marcel set up practice along the Yonne River in a city that is French. It's called Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, and I'm going to refer to it as VSY throughout the rest of this because I am not going to be able to pronounce it again.
I was going to say, are you sure that's what it's called? 50-50 chance.
50-50 chance, yes. I'm sure I butchered it. This little village sits on this Yonne River. The Yonne River flows into the Seine at some point. So you can see it's probably this little idyllic village. When he opened his practice, he was only 25 years old, and the other doctors in the village were old men with established practices. They had been in the community forever. Marcel thought, well, how am I going to persuade patients to visit him instead of their lifelong doctors? And he developed a clever advertising campaign. He printed flyers that said, quote, Dr. Petiot is young, and only a young doctor can keep up to date on the latest methods born of progress, which marches with giant strides. This is why intelligent patients have confidence in him.
Oh, so I want to be an intelligent patient, so I'm going to call him.
I'm going to call him because he's up on the latest. He soon found himself with no shortage of patients, which may be due in part to the fact that he was willing to prescribe narcotics to anyone who asked for them, all while jacking up the prices to these patients. He also performed illegal abortions and charged exorbitant fees for those. So he had these patients that were all too willing to overpay him to guarantee he would keep his mouth shut. Word got out to fellow doctors in the village that Marcel was performing these illegal and unethical procedures, and they tried to persuade his patients to testify against him, but in doing so, they'd be admitting that they were, in fact, breaking the law.
Right.
So nobody told on Marcel.
And they don't want their business out there.
Right. In deciding to turn a blind eye to the more ethical practices of medicine, Marcel made a fortune. He also added to his earnings by double dipping. So when patients would come for whatever treatment he was providing, whether it was an abortion or for drugs, he had them sign forms that were applications for state funding to cover more legitimate procedures, and therefore the government would pay him in addition to what the patients gave him. Marcel soon became the most eligible bachelor in town, and he had a lot of fun being the center of attention. He enjoyed the company of the beautiful young ladies around the village, and he would lie to them to get them into bed, and then leave them once he got what he wanted. He got away with doing this over and over due to the shame that the women felt after being taken advantage of, especially when he let the affairs draw out for weeks and months. Like, these women would think, oh, he's going to marry me.
So he's a player.
Yeah, and then he would break up with them. He was constantly getting laid. If it wasn't from his latest conquest in the village, he also accepted sexual payments from the drug addicts who came to see him.
What? This guy is a fucking tool. Wow, he's got it going on. He's got it figured out.
When I heard this story, Talia, I just couldn't believe it was true. But it is. So it sounds like a movie.
It does.
One woman he deceived was the daughter of one of his older patients. Her name was Louise Delaveau. In May 1926, when she figured out that Marcel was a piece of shit who wasn't going to fulfill his promise of marrying her, she confronted him. With all the fury she could muster, she stormed into his practice and confronted him. She disappeared after that, vanishing without a trace. Her father got the police involved a few days later because he couldn't find her, and they interviewed Marcel. He told them that, yeah, it was true, he was involved with Louise, however, he hadn't seen her either. Relying on his reputation in the community, the police believed the young, respectable doctor. However, neighbors told the cops that on the night Louise disappeared, they observed Marcel struggling to load a very heavy trunk into his car. He refused help from others when they tried to intervene. Oh, no, I got it. The next morning, his car was back at his home with no trunk in sight. The police wrote Louise's case off as a runaway, but her father was never satisfied with that decision.
Was he respected simply because he was a doctor? Because the things you've described that he's doing in the community aren't very respectable.
Right.
But it must be just because he has that title.
Yes. And there's no complaints against him, and yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right, because his name never got complained.
That same year, Marcel ran for mayor.
Stop it.
When he and his opponent were having their first public debate, Marcel had hired a man to disrupt the debate whenever his opponent tried to respond. I know. The opponent was drowned out by screams and insults from the crowd, and at one point, someone began flinging rotten fruit at him.
Nothing's changed in like 100 years, has it?
No.
Oh, Lord.
Marcel won the debate and the election.
Oh, my God.
So now he's mayor. It's the best. He got married in 1927 to a woman named Georgette, and they had a son the next year. You would think that marriage and fatherhood would slow him down and maybe give him a reason to go legit, but no, he did not stop any of his shady shit. He just got worse. He also never felt the feelings like you feel towards your children. He's a psychopath.
Right.
But he did provide for his family, gave them anything they ever needed or wanted with the money he ripped off from other people.
What a good dad.
I know, what a good dad. Around this time, like after he won the election and got married, a trunk was discovered in a nearby river. When it was opened, it contained the remains of a young woman. She had been dismembered and was in a very advanced state of decomposition. No one thought to put the disappearance of Louise Delavaux together. With this discovery, Marcel, being the mayor of the nearest town to the river, was informed, but he showed no sign of recognition when he was informed of the news.
She was dismembered?
She was dismembered. I know.
But all her remains were together?
Mm-hmm.
What's the point of dismemberment?
I know. You're right. You're right. Why are they in the trunk? Maybe to get her to fit in the trunk?
I don't know. Maybe.
I don't know how big the trunk was.
Or is he a sick bastard, Tanya?
That too, probably. In 1930, a man named Armand, his home was destroyed by a fire. It was burned to the ground. He wasn't home when the fire began. He was working his job at a local dairy. However, his wife Henrietta was. The next morning, after the fire had finally been extinguished, her blackened body was found at the center of where the fire began. Despite the advanced burning of the body, she still showed signs of being beaten. Police determined she had been beaten to death with a blunt instrument, and the fire was started to cover the crime. They thought she must have interrupted a burglary in progress and paid dearly with her life. They believed this because they discovered that 20,000 francs in cash had been stolen from the home. Footprints were discovered walking away from the house, through the field, back to the town of VSY. Police figured the killer must be from there, and Marcel, as the mayor, told the press that he would do everything he could to help the investigation. As he spoke to the press, he petted the bloodhounds who had been gathered to hunt down the killer. The bloodhounds failed miserably, just looping around between the police, the town, and Marcel.
Oh, shit. And he's petting the bloodhounds?
Yes.
This guy is so... What's the word? I can't even...
Shameless.
Shameless, thank you.
The police did get one really hot tip about the murder. Armand and Henrietta's neighbor, Monsieur Fiscat, had seen a dark-haired man coming and going quite a bit from the home over the last several months. He suspected that Henrietta had a lover, and Henrietta herself had told her friends that she had been having an affair because her husband was gone at work so often and away from the house. She told her friends that her boyfriend was a very important man in the area, and if the story of the affair got out, he would lose his respectability in the community. It would just cause a great scandal. This knowledge fueled Henrietta's interest in him because he chose to see her when he had so much to lose. Like, it was just this romantic relationship to her.
It's like a soap opera.
For sure. Monsieur Fiscat was scheduled to come to the police station in VSY to make an official statement. On the day he was supposed to go, he decided to stop at Marcel's doctor's office due to the pain he had that was caused by rheumatoid arthritis. While in the waiting room, waiting for the good doctor, Monsieur Fiscat reveled in telling Dr. Petiot's staff the story he was going to the police with. He loved the excitement of being the center of attention in such a juicy drama. So he's telling them, oh yeah, Henrietta was having this affair. So he's telling the staff, oh, my neighbor was having this affair with this very important man, and now she's dead, and oh my God. According to his medical record of the visit, Monsieur Fiscat visited with Marcel and left his office without any treatment being administered. However, a few short hours later, he died by aneurysm, and Marcel signed his death certificate. Later, it would be discovered that Marcel gave Monsieur Fiscat an injection, claiming it would help treat his arthritis, and its true purpose didn't take effect until a few hours later. Without Monsieur Fiscat's story, the police never connected Marcel to Henrietta.
So did the neighbor OD? Is that what we're thinking happened? Like a morphine overdose?
I don't know if it was a morphine overdose or if it was poison he was injected with, but it was something that didn't take effect for hours.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
So I'm not sure. Before I tell you more, we're going to take a break. Marcel was eventually suspended as mayor in 1931 when the local government magistrate got complaints about Marcel being involved in shady deals. He took bribes and embezzled from the town funds. Marcel resigned, and in an incredible show of solidarity, the village council members also resigned.
Dumbasses.
I know. 5 weeks later, in October 1931, Marcel was elected as councillor for the Yan district. It seemed like this man could do no wrong, no matter what the frauds he committed.
He must be charming.
Must be.
Or he's giving lots of free drugs out to people. One of the two.
In 1932, he was accused of stealing electricity for his own personal use from the village, and he lost a seat on the council. By this time, however, Marcel had already moved on to Paris, on to bigger and better schemes. He opened up a new practice in Paris, and soon it was booming based on more bullshit advertising and grandiose endorsements from supposed former patients. He continued his less than ethical practices and being quite loose with his prescriptions for narcotic drugs and performing illegal abortions.
I'm sure you can get away with a lot more in
a big city. In 1934, a 30-year-old woman named Raymond Hans went to Marcel to drain an abscess in her mouth. He drugged her heavily with morphine, and while she was unconscious, he rifled through her purse and took all the money she had in excess of the payment she owed him. He punctured the abscess and waited for her to wake up. Unfortunately, though, he had been heavy-handed with administering the morphine and had caused her to overdose.
Oops.
She wasn't going to wake up. He carried her to his car, drove her home, and put her in bed fully clothed.
So he took her to her house?
Yes.
And put her in her bed?
Yes.
Oh.
The next morning, her mother discovered her body, cold by then, and she couldn't make sense of what happened to her daughter. She went to Marcel, who told her he performed the operation without incident. An autopsy was performed on Raymond, and they did find a high level of morphine in her body. Marcel wasn't blamed, however, because it couldn't be proven that he provided her with the lethal dose. He claimed to have only given her a local anesthetic, and that was what was reported on her medical record. Marcel began to feel invincible with every new murder he committed. In 1935, a former patient of his finally mustered the courage to report Marcel. The patient had been a drug addict and spoke about how Marcel gave him whatever he wanted. The man had gotten clean and wanted to prevent others from falling into the same trap he did with Dr. Petiot. Unfortunately, he was soon found in his rented room overdosed on morphine. The complaint was dismissed against Marcel when the complainant died. The man's death was ruled an accident, but it should be noted that Marcel knew where the man lived, had access to morphine, and definitely had a motive.
And we know he goes into people's houses.
He has no problem with that.
Bringing in dead bodies, putting them in bed.
Right.
Right?
Right. He's just killing people left and right.
Murdering his lover, beating her up, setting her house on fire. Allegedly.
I know. He was not charged with that crime.
I wouldn't put it past him. Anything.
Oh, I'm sure he did all of these.
Probably stole cable. They didn't have it back then. Otherwise, he'd be stealing someone's cable.
Mm-hmm. In 1936, he was given authority to write death certificates for anyone who died in his section of Paris.
Oh, shit.
So it would seem that the people of the government just didn't put much stock in any of the rumors or accusations that people made against Marcel.
Well, a lot of them, the one guy was a drug addict.
Right. You're probably wondering, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, how did Marcel turn this into a money-making scheme? He used the home visits he went on as an opportunity to check things out in the deceased person's homes, and he took valuables, anything he was able to snatch.
So he was like a coroner, right?
Yeah.
Investigating death scenes.
Yep.
And
looking around, seeing what people had. Some relatives did report missing items to police, but they accused the police officers of taking them. By then, Marcel was a wealthy doctor, so no one thought he was taking small items of personal property, but he suffered from kleptomania. I know. It's true, though. He had a brother, and I didn't really go into a lot of his background, but he had gone to dinner at his brother's house, and he pocketed the silverware. And his brother's like, what the hell? But he had an illness, right?
My grandma had a friend, and she was wealthy, and she was an older lady, and she would just steal stupid little things. Yeah. It was a total thrill for her. She's an old lady.
I know, there are things he could easily pay for, but...
Winona Ryder?
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. You're right. Just a little thrill. Marcel was eventually caught in August 1937 shoplifting a book. He managed to get away from the officer who tried to arrest him, but 2 days later he turned himself in with his wife by his side. He was briefly committed to a private sanatorium that Georgette found for him after his military record was put into the court record. And as you remember, he was deemed to have 100% disability due to mental illness. His defense consisted of him claiming that his mental illness had been kept at bay since his military days, and it flared back up when he became obsessed with a machine that was used to treat constipation.
I am so confused and lost right now.
This machine had a suction that was placed at the anus, And he had used it excessively, causing an unbalance in his mind, which then caused him to be confused that the book was really his when he slipped it in his pocket, and he ran away from the officer because he didn't recognize the uniform when the officer came up to him and started to manhandle him.
Is this really happening now?
I
Are you
know.
really telling me this?
Yes, that's the excuse he used.
I'm sorry.
I was using this
So
machine that...
This machine was on my ass and it just sucked the brains out of me. I don't
I
understand.
became really imbalanced because I overused it.
I'm sorry. Okay.
I know.
I don't think that machine is still being used these days.
I hope not. Marcel claimed he was the victim and not the perpetrator. His stay at the private sanatorium was very brief when he claimed he was cured, and this got back to the French government, who ended his disability pension. Before his release, he was examined by doctors, and they all believed that he was just a master manipulator who used the court system to his own advantage. So he ended up truly losing his disability pension. When Marcel was released, his medical reputation took a hit. Several months went by before the rumors of him being in the sanatorium died down, but eventually they did, and his patients came back. At this point, he refused to do illegal abortions or be so free with his prescription pad because he decided he wasn't going to allow himself to be attacked ever again. With all of these avenues of revenue drying up, Marcel moved on and decided to commit tax fraud to make up for some of the lost revenue. He only reported a fraction of his income, and soon he was in tax court. He was fined and sentenced to several weeks in prison, but the endless appeals he filed kept him out of being locked up. Finally, the court eventually consented to remove his sentence if he would just go away.
Where's he supposed to go?
Well, they just dropped it. They were like, fine, just don't show up.
It.
Yeah, he was just a nuisance. This occurred right before the outbreak of World War II in 1939, and the fall of France and the Nazis were right around the corner. As the war got underway, Marcel contributed to the war effort by providing falsified medical certificates to French citizens who were drafted into forced labor in Germany, and he also provided medical treatments to soldiers when they came back to France. Marcel told anyone who would listen that he was helping the Allies in the war by developing secret weapons that would kill Germans without leaving forensic evidence. He did that by day. And then at night, he would hold important meetings with high-ranking Allied commanders. He was important.
Really?
No.
Okay.
He was making all this shit up. He told stories about his work with the French resistance. Ever the money earner, his most lucrative business was developing an escape route / spy network called Flytox, and his alias was Dr. Eugene. Things got a little out of hand when Marcel began falsifying disability documents, not just for soldiers, but for anyone who had money enough to pay his fee. Business was booming, and therefore Marcel opened another office across town from his current office. He rented a private mansion on the east side of the Seine. It was a very large space, but it was very beautiful, and he just had to have it. While working from the mansion, Marcel met with people who were desperate to escape the Nazi occupation of France. These so-called patients were mostly of Jewish descent, and they would offer the mysterious Dr. Eugene substantial sums of money for his help in finding them a way out of occupied France. It soon became a well-kept secret that Dr. Eugene had ties to the resistance and would help smuggle people out of France. When people came to seek help from Dr. Eugene, each person brought with them the fee of 2,500 francs that was required by Marcel, and that's probably close to $2,500.
And that was for him to help them escape.
The fee would pay their passage. Marcel told them he had friends in an anti-fascist group in Spain who had a route people could take through Portugal. And from there, they would take a ship to Argentina, where they could begin new lives. When they came to Dr. Eugene, the people would not only have their passage fee on them, they also pretty much had every valuable thing they owned.
Yeah, because they're starting over.
Right. Usually bringing a suitcase, carrying their most valuable worldly possessions. They expected to leave France immediately after visiting Dr. Eugene. So all the people who visited him told no friends and family who were left behind that they were going underground. They would be able to contact them and get in touch with them once they arrived at their destination safely. After arriving in Argentina, there would be locals ready to welcome them into their community, as long as their paperwork and everything else was in order. The underground community knew that this was very dangerous work that Dr. Eugene did, and that the Gestapo was right around the corner. People who planned to visit him had to have the utmost discretion and couldn't breathe a word of it about their upcoming appointment to anyone who wasn't within their tight inner circle.
I see where this is going.
One such man who was headed to a visit to Dr. Eugene was a man named Valentin. Valentin's days as a free Jew in France were numbered, and he knew it. He expected every night when he went to bed that he would be startled awake in the middle of the night by members of the Gestapo and taken to a train to be carted off to parts unknown. At the time, the world didn't know the true horrors of the Holocaust, but people knew that their friends, neighbors, and family were disappearing without a trace. Valentin wanted to avoid this route, so he sought out Dr. Eugene. As Valentin headed to Dr. Eugene's mansion, he thought about the cash that was in his pocket. Every franc he had was with him, and he was hoping he'd be left with some money to start his new life. Not knowing exactly where he'd end up, Valentin didn't care. He just wanted out of France and his life, and he decided it didn't matter whether he had any money left. His life was worth more than all the money in the world. Valentin arrived to the mansion, and he knocked on the front door. He nervously looked around, waiting for his knock to be answered. He stood there an uncomfortable amount of time, with no answer. He wondered if he should knock again, and as he raised his hand to do so, the door opened, and Dr. Eugene, Marcel, stood before him. The two men didn't say a word as Dr. Eugene ushered him inside the building. Once safely inside, Valentin told Dr. Eugene he needed to get out of France immediately. He was desperate and felt the need to relay the urgency of his plight. He told Dr. Eugene that he must escape because he was already on the radar of the Gestapo. Dr. Eugene seemed concerned at this and began to question Valentin and whether he had led the enemy to his door. Was he sure he wasn't followed? Was he sure he didn't leave a note behind of where he went? Had he told anyone where he was going that afternoon? Valentin assured him he was not followed and that he would never endanger his future by leaving word behind of where he went. Dr. Eugene seemed to be calmed by Valentin's guarantee that he didn't put their mission in danger. The doctor asked if he had brought money with him. He had, and the doctor made sure that Valentin was ready to depart right then. Like, are you ready to go now? But first, he had to get his proper immunizations.
Shots.
Yes. When Valentin wasn't looking, Dr. Eugene was upon him and stuck a needle in his arm. Valentin was surprised by the swiftness and the pain in his arm, and the pain was almost gone within seconds. However, numbness started to spread from the injection point across his arm, and he wasn't able to move it. He tried to tell the doctor that something was wrong, but he couldn't breathe in the air that's required to speak. He struggled to wave his arms to the doctor, but with his voice immobilized and Dr. Eugene with his back to him, the doctor didn't seem to notice Valentin's struggle.
Was he given something that paralyzed the muscles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Valentin was confused when he saw the doctor going through the pockets of his overcoat, and he toppled.
Shit.
I know. And he toppled over in the chair he was sitting. He fell face first, and his nose hit the tile floor with a crunch, his warm blood just seeping from his nostrils. Valentin continued to watch as every penny he owned and all of his important papers were taken from his coat, even the ones he had hid in the lining. The lining of his coat was no match for the skilled scalpel of Dr. Eugene. Valentin's lungs were paralyzed and he couldn't breathe anymore. As he lay dying, he watched the doctor strip him of his clothing and begin to draw on his body.
To draw?
Marcel was making marks where he would cut Valentin's limbs from his torso with a pen. Valentin had recognition in his eyes up to the point where Marcel went to retrieve his bone saw. Thankfully, Valentin would not be alive to see what came next. He wasn't the first person that Marcel killed in this manner. It's reported he killed upwards of 27 people, but I believe it was probably a much higher number.
So that is up to the point where you believe Valentin was conscious, right? But not necessarily dead when he started getting sawed.
Right. There are people who thought that the victims could have been still alive when he started with the saw. On March 6th, 1944, Marcel's neighbors of his mansion in Paris noticed that the smoke that was coming from the chimney of the home had a weird smell. 5 days later, one neighbor went to the home to complain to Marcel, but instead found a note tacked to the door that said he was going to be away for a month. With nothing left to do, the neighbors called the police to report what seemed to be a fire, and they told the cops that Marcel was the owner of the home. The police were familiar with Marcel and called him at his home across town. Marcel said, "I'm on my way. Don't go inside." But after the police waited for half an hour with no Marcel in sight, they were forced to call the fire department because they noticed a fire appeared to be spreading inside the home.
So it wasn't just smoke anymore.
Right. The fire department arrived and gained access to the house through windows on the second story, which were already opened. A crowd had started to gather outside, and the neighbors, along with the police, could hear a commotion coming from inside the house. After several minutes, the front door flung open, and several firefighters came rushing outside, only to throw up in the garden. In between the retching and yelling, police officers understood that there was something unusual going on in the house. So several officers went inside to investigate. First, they noticed the smoke filling the home, coming from fires set in several wood-burning stoves that were placed throughout the home. Like, it just doesn't have one, there's several. Inside of the stoves, instead of wood sticking out, it was various body parts sticking out of the stove. It was just brimming with body parts. Going up the stairs, one officer tripped over a sack that was lying on the steps, knocking into it, and that caused a human head to roll out of the bag and bounce down the stairs into the entry hall.
Oh my God.
I know.
That's why they ran out vomiting.
Mm-hmm. Investigating the basement and the furnace area, officers found a pit filled with quicklime and various large body parts, each in its own stage of decomposition. More bodies were found throughout the home, and numerous suitcases were found scattered about, stuffed with personal belongings of the dead. In the garage, police found a fresh pit that had been dug, heaped with more bodies and quicklime nearby, ready to cover the makeshift gravesite.
Damn.
I know.
Wow. You know how bad that had to have smelled
Oh my
before
God.
he lit that on fire?
Oh,
I
know. It
mean-
had to reek.
Dead bodies everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And and some of them have been there a while.
Right. Unless you're telling me he's a mass murderer at one time.
No, not at one time. In one room, police did find something like an assembly line of death. It kind of reminded me of like an animal processing plant.
What?
I know. At the start,
An assembly line of death? Did you make that up right now?
I just made that up. At the start, bodies were stripped of the belongings and clothing. Next came a station where gold fillings were pulled and gold rings cut from fingers of the dead. Along the line, bodies were dismembered, and at the end was a pile of bodies waiting to be transferred to the stoves or the pits, depending on the size of the remains.
You have to be kidding me.
I'm not. I know. This is crazy.
You just don't give a fuck.
No, there's just fucking bodies everywhere.
Wow.
So Marcel was called, and he arrived in the midst of this. And
He took his time getting there.
And he's like, "Oh, hey, guys." He claimed he was a member of the resistance and that the bodies all belonged to Germans. The police were hesitant to arrest him and instead released him from custody after he gave this explanation.
Just because you're part of the resistance doesn't mean you can have an assembly of dead bodies.
Yeah, why
in
is
a
it
mansion,
okay to murder
right?
people, right? And steal? The police were like, "Oh." The police commissioner who was in charge of the investigation did research whether Marcel was part of the resistance or the Gestapo, but he was cleared of being a traitor and a member of the Gestapo when a telegram was intercepted from German command demanding that Marcel be arrested, because the Gestapo, he was on the radar of the Gestapo too. They didn't know if he was a spy, what was going on. Was he smuggling people out of France, like truly smuggling them? The investigation continued, and Marcel went underground. The home he shared with his wife was searched, and police found large amounts of chloroform, the poison digitalis, and other poisons growing in his garden. So those are the poisons he used. He grew them himself. Eventually, police realized that Marcel wasn't a member of the French resistance, and that the victims found in his home were not Germans, but instead French citizens. Marcel's brother, Maurice, was arrested, After confessing he delivered quicklime to Marcel upon his request. His brother didn't know what he was doing with it, though. But he would just make these deliveries. Marcel's wife, Georgette, was also arrested.
Well, I'm just saying, I mean, you have a brother, I have a brother. If my brother asked me to deliver some quicklime.
Right?
Large amounts of quicklime.
Hey, like, what you gonna be doing with that?
Just saying.
He's like, oh, it must be something medical. I don't know. But he claimed he didn't know. And Georgette was arrested upon suspicion of helping him. But both Maurice and Georgette were cleared, and they were found innocent of any charges. On June 6th, 1944, the investigation of Marcel had to be put on hold when the Allies invaded Normandy, and France was liberated from the Nazis. So in the meantime, all this weird shit's going on. There's a fucking war.
Oh, yeah.
Right? In France. Marcel stayed in hiding for several months, staying with friends and claiming that the Gestapo was after him because he had killed German soldiers and spies. While living with a former patient, Marcel grew a beard and took on several aliases, one being Henri Valéry. As Henri, Marcel joined the French forces of the interior and became a captain in charge of counter-espionage and prisoner interrogations.
For real?
For real.
Shut the fuck up.
Isn't this great?
What?
Yeah.
You were just making up some bullshit?
Nope. I wish I was making it up. It sounds like I'm making it up.
Oh, my Lord. I have no words.
An article was published about Henri in a resistance newspaper, and when Marcel read it, he had to write to his lawyer to tell him that the publisher printed lies about him. And when I say his lawyer, it's Marcel's lawyer that helped him. This letter gave police a clue that Marcel was still in Paris, and now Henri Valéry was on their radar. Marcel was finally arrested on October 31st, 1945, when someone recognized him at a Paris metro station. He had in his possession a gun, 31,700 francs, and 50 sets of false identities with his photo. He went on trial in March of 1946. He claimed to be innocent and that he had only killed enemies of France. His supposed ties to the resistance were never proven, and he was charged with 27 murders for profit that ended up earning him about 200,000 francs, or about $216,000. That would be in 1946's money, so it was a lot of money. During the trial, he confessed to 60 killings, though, still maintaining that they were Germans. He was convicted, finally, of 26 murders and sentenced to death. Being a Frenchman, he was put to death by guillotine on May 25th, 1946. A few days prior...
They didn't waste any time.
No, it was like 2 months later. A few days prior, the prison tried to carry out their death sentence on Marcel, but the guillotine was rusted, and they had to wait for a replacement.
I say they should have used the rusted one.
Nice dull guillotine.
Perfect. 60 murders?
I know.
That's pretty proficient.
It is. In case you were wondering, why did he have all these bodies in the house? Like, why didn't he dispose of them other ways?
Like in a trunk.
Yeah. In the beginning, when he started the scheme, he did try dumping body parts in the Seine River, but they started washing up.
Oh.
Yeah.
Why didn't he burn them or something?
I know. He's burning them in the wood stoves.
Well, he's not doing it fast enough.
I know. He wasn't doing it fast enough. He was killing too many people.
And you made it seem like he had stoves all over the place.
I know, right?
Well, that's how many people he must have killed.
Yes. That's why I'm thinking it had to be. It's definitely more than 27.
It takes a long time to burn a body because it's mostly water.
I know. And it's got to be more than 60. If he's willing to admit to 60, it's got to be more than that.
Wow.
There was a French film that was released in 1990 called Dr. Petiot that told the story. And there was also a film in 2006 directed by Paul Verhoeven. I think Paul Verhoeven might have done RoboCop.
You're looking at me like I know.
Anyway, it took place during the German occupation of the Netherlands and had a character that very much resembled Marcel Petiot in both appearance and activities. And I don't know what happened to Georgette or his son, but...
That's embarrassing.
I know. And there was a book I read for the story. It was called Dr. Satan.
Dr. Satan
by Ryan Green. And there was a story in there that he gave some of the jewelry he stole from people to Georgette.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Nice of him. Romantic.
So, yeah, it was just a mess. Anyway, I found this story fascinating. I couldn't believe it was true, as I've mentioned probably 3 times now. It's just so crazy.
It is crazy.
And then I've never heard about it.
He's such an egomaniac, too.
Right.
Narcissism at its finest with him.
He's just killing people, not thinking about it. Killing this one, killing that one.
Getting laid all over, killing his lovers.
Right? I mean, geez.
Chopping bodies up, chopping bodies.
Chopping bodies.
Chopping broccoli.
So, yeah. Isn't that crazy?
That's crazy. That one goes on the crazy list.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Talia. And before we go, we've got some shout-outs.
Yes, we do.
Okay, Talia, take it away.
This is going to be a slaughter of its own. I'm so horrible at names. All right, so this is special thanks to all of our newest Apple channel subscribers and our Patreons. And this is our way of showing how much we really appreciate and value you guys for subscribing. Drum roll. It was good.
Thanks.
Jess R., Rhiannon, Chrissa W., Shannon L., Mary B., Cecilia V., Anastasia, Megan, Scylla, Danny P., Huang Pham, Anisha, Jordan U., Jeanne A., Chris P., Tim D., Christina H., Jeff S., Dana, Jessica, and Jessica's lovely husband, JR, not Junior, JR, Jordan B., and Chantel.
Thank you, everyone. Whoop, 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 whoop.
If you guys want to check out our Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/TNT Crimes. T for Talia, N for N.
Tanya. Yeah.
N.
Yeah. Tanya.
And T for Tanya. You can also, if you have Apple, check out our Apple channel. Subscribe through there. And you can find out more information by going to crimesandconsequences.com too, where you can also get some of our online-only free episodes. They are there.
You can find out more information about today's episode by going to our website, crimesandconsequences.com. You can also find out information about becoming a Patreon on that website. There's photos from the episodes.
Merchandise,
all kinds of good stuff. You can also find us on social media on Facebook and Instagram at Hardcore True Crime.
Hardcore
True Crime.
Took you a second.
And I believe that's all the business we have for today. Oh, we're going to CrimeCon.
CrimeCon.
So if you're headed there, please come see us. And until our next episode.
You can find us on Podcast Row.
Yes.
Don't kill each other.
Bye.
Bye.